Continuing on the expedition from the previous episode, we're going to be following Jacob Zappi as he continues to search for evidence of Bigfoot within Washington state, and maybe even uncovered some Bigfoot hair. If you've not watched part 1, make sure you go ahead and watch that now before checking out this video. I had commissioned Jacob, a local author and paranormal enthusiast, to explore the local legends surrounding the ape caves near Mount St. Helens in Washington state. He and his friends took up the challenge and embarked on 2 expeditions to the area. After a day and a night of strange events, they are ready to plunge into the dark depths of this 1.5-mile gargantuan cavern system. Day 2, where Jacob and his 2 friends awoke early that day and prepared their breakfast. Their appointment to hike through the ape caves was from 1 to 1:30, so they had plenty of time to kill. The trio decided that they needed to head back into town to try and pick up another lead in an area where they could camp for that night. As they drove down the mountain, a large sign had caught Jacob's eye. He had asked his friend Joe to stop so that they could check it out. It was a sign that marked the Cedar research area. They got out to investigate further. An informational sign said that the area was some of the only untouched parts of the forest in that section. In the 1940s, it was decided to save this swatch of land untouched to monitor how a primordial forest evolves. The trail was only a mile long and seemed pretty remote. Jacob has had good luck with random hikes, so they all agreed to check it out. Jacob can honestly say that this was probably the most giant trees he has ever seen in one grove. He has been to the Sequoia Park in California several times. While that might have had bigger trees, this area has many more that are closer together. Each giant in this 115-acre grove had to be pushing 1,000 years of age. He explained to his friends that this is the type of forest that Sasquatch likes to live in. Even if this particular grove was too busy for them, another similar one in a more remote location would make an ideal habitat. At one point, they found a giant cedar tree that had been struck by lightning and toppled over. Inside was a large cavern easily 20 feet in diameter. Jacob jumped in through a crack, and the friends then discussed how this was easily big enough to make a small house or a secret shelter. Jacob told his friends that most cedar trees have similar caverns even while still alive. After completing the walkthrough, the ancient grove, the friends headed back towards the town of Cougar. They had to stop and get some gas, and there are 2 stores to pick from. They chose the one with the most updated gas pumps, called Lakeside 24-Hour Fuel. However, the gas pumps are still left over from the late 90s. They did not have a digital display for the money in gallons. Jacob had to refresh his friend's memory on how to use a pump like this. They went into the store to retrieve refreshments. Upon entering, the friends looked at each other because they instantly knew that this was a great place to inquire about Sasquatch. The store had Sasquatch everything. Jacob flipped through their rack of t-shirts and picked out a design that he had never seen before. It was of a Sasquatch exiting the ape caves to a colorful sunset. As he was purchasing this and a delicious cheesesteak sandwich, he started small talk with the clerk. Jacob first asked about the shirt design. The clerk said he had designed the shirt himself. Jacob commented on how nice it was. The clerk said that he was hoping the contrast would have been better. Jacob has found that encouraging and engaging small talk will often loosen tongues when trying to gather intel, and this time proved no different. Jacob asked if the clerk had ever had an encounter. He said he had not. Jacob then followed up with tales from the night before. The clerk listened amazed. Jacob then asked if he had heard of anything like that happening recently. He set up the road from an area of town called Horse Camp. An incident had been reported just a few weeks prior. He said that a local was hired to guard logging equipment in that same area, and he said that it had been getting damaged by suspected vandals in the night. The local parked his Jeep but soon fell asleep. He was awoken in the middle of the night by his Jeep being shaken violently. So he wakes up, turns on all the lights, scans the surrounding. He stayed up for several hours but soon fell asleep again out of exhaustion. He was woken a second time in the exact same manner. His Jeep was being shaken violently from side to side, and by this time, the man was so scared he pulled out the pistol he had with him and just began shooting at random directions. After discharging his entire magazine, the shaking had ceased. The man stayed up for the rest of the night without any more incidents, and the next day he resigned his position as an impromptu watchman. Jacob thanked the clerk for the tale, and the crew double-checked the location of the horse camp area on a map with the clerk himself. They had a potential location for the second night's camping area. It was now close to 1 o'clock, and they needed to make their way to the ape caves to get there on time for their appointment. When they had arrived, they saw the most people that they had seen in several hours. It was only a Tuesday, so there were still only about 50 or so people present in total. Jacob was amazed at the lack of oversight at the cave entrance. A sign was posted on the ranger's shed that they were to write the reservation number on a sheet of paper and affix it to the car window. Further, they were supposed to register for a day pass at a metal box. During this time, there was no personnel that was double-checking the system. The friends did as directed, then stopped by the information booth and gift shop. This gift shop was filled with tons of interesting souvenirs, including lanterns to safely navigate the caverns. Jacob would, however, recommend that you bring 2 headlamps. This way, your hands are free for all the required climbing. They then walked the short path to the cave entrance. Even though it was the trio's appointed time, a teenage couple followed them most of the way. One of the friends had suggested confronting the couple, but Jacob assured him that it was not their role to enforce rules that the park had no way of enforcing. Now, during the next 1.5 hours and over 1.5 miles, the friends had a rough spelunking expedition. The ape caves are not for people that are not in decent shape. You can expect numerous times where you have to climb over massive boulders. Not to mention the intermittent boulder fields. There is no light other than your own headlamp. However, the entire cave system is lined by crystal structures that reflect light in amazing ways to illuminate beams a much further distance than should be possible. The caves are not stuffy, and most of the way, you are in massive cavern chambers. Jacob found himself surprised at just how much ventilation there was with how deep they were underground. These caves are pretty well traveled. However, there are numerous side tunnels that a person has access to, but several more that are no foreseeable way out to reach without dynamite or other mining equipment. Several hundred Sasquatches could easily be living and traversing in the next tunnel over, under, above, and the average person would have no way to detect them. A person has to keep in mind the enormous strength of a Sasquatch or two. A seeming immovable boulder would be nothing but a slight inconvenience to a determined duo of Sasquatches. Massive boulders seem to precariously block side passages in abundance in the depths of the ape caves. Neither of Jacob's 2 friends seemed exactly enthusiastic about exploring side tunnels that could have been climbed too with relative ease on this quest. Joe began to complain vocally about turning around after about 45 minutes. Jacob ignored him, moving further ahead to enjoy the mission to the end of the caves. Nothing strange happened during the hike. They heard and saw the lights of the teenage couple behind them uncomfortably close several times. Jacob is a big dude, and the caves for the most part are easily accommodated his size with room to spare. It was not hard to imagine an 8-foot Sasquatch being able to use these caves or similar ones to navigate throughout the region. Jacob cannot take credit for this hypothesis of Sasquatch living and using caves on his own. He first heard of this from tribal members that were from the Elwha tribe. They told stories about Sasquatch moving massive boulders to come out into the human realm, just like how the supposed Gigantopithecus remains were only found in remote caves in China. Jacob wondered what if Sasquatch remains were never found because people are looking in the wrong place. Instead of looking in the forests, they should conduct archaeological digs in caverns to find their remains. Jacob was talking to his neighbor, who is a non-believer, about the trip and after these events. He seemed to think that this idea of Sasquatch burying their dead in caves was a stretch. Jacob reminded him that they are not dumb beings and have at least a minimal degree of civilization and intelligence. If they have lived underground and cared for their tribal members, why would they leave one of their ancestor corpses rotting in the forest to be found by interloping humans? He was remarking that Jacob had no evidence other than the legends and hearsay of tribal lore when an unknown truck pulled in front of the house. Jacob thought that this truck pulling up in their community was strange. A large man with long hair and tan skin jumped from the driver's side. Even though Jacob did not recognize him, he greeted him in a friendly manner. Turns out, it was a friend of the neighbors named Andy. It just so happened that Andy was a member of the Quinault tribe. Jacob asked him to co-sign some of his beliefs on Sasquatch. Jacob had met this man 3 minutes before. Not only did he co-sign about the legitimacy of Sasquatch, but he shared a tale of seeing the cryptid himself on the reservation in the 90s. He told a tale of him and some cousins having a barbecue on the beach when they saw a strange creature down the way. He called attention to it, and he and his cousins slowly made their way down the beach to the strange figure. They witnessed a creature he could only describe as a large, ape-like beast digging in the shore for clams before devouring them raw. The cousins watched this for several moments in disbelief from behind some brush. They had all been bear hunting, and this was clearly no bear. Eventually, the creature had noticed them hiding in the bushes, spying on him. It immediately waded into the water towards a rocky outcropping. Andy said that he had fished in that area and knew that there was a shallow alcove on the other side of the outcrop. The creature waded in until the water would have been well over a human's head, but yet its head and torso were still well above water. Andy estimated the Sasquatch to be well over 8 feet. The cousins lost track of the beast as it waded out of the sight around the bend. They scrambled from their hiding spot to follow the creature, thinking they had now trapped it. Clinging to the rocks, they climbed around the corner, but all they found were large footprints leading to a seemingly impossible rock wall in the back of the small alcove. These tracks were very large, and Annie described them as large and looking barefoot, with toe imprints in the sand. At this point, Jacob told him about his investigation. Up to this point, he had no idea that Jacob had just investigated the ape caves and about how he suspected that Sasquatch used caves to move around, moving large boulders or cleverly concealed portals to gain access to cave systems. When Jacob told him of the ape caves investigation, he said that he had heard stories of the tunnels in the area being a metropolis for these creatures. By this time, the neighbor was feeling strange vibes. Jacob and his friend Andy had never met before and had no way to corroborate their stories. The neighbor began to call them drunk liars in a joking manner. Jacob told the neighbor that he felt the same way when, as a young man, his native friends had him talk to the elders about Sasquatch. The neighbor still insisted Jacob was making up stories to sell books and YouTube content. At this point, Andy spoke up and said that his grandmother had shared many stories about Sasquatch and that his neighbor would be in big trouble if he called her a liar. The conversation ended, the neighbor and Andy left for his house. Jacob appreciates the universe for supplying Andy at that specific moment to help convert an unbeliever and give his neighborhood something to ponder on. Much like the journey through the ape caves, both the hike and conversation had reached their conclusions. The friends had reached the end ladder, leading up to glorious daylight, much like how they had reached the end of their conversation on the validity of Sasquatch legends. Either the neighbor would see the light as Jacob did at the end of the cave, or continue to live in darkness, rejecting the evidence for Sasquatch. Upon exiting, this is not the end of the hike. You must then hike 1.5 miles on a path through a forest to reach the parking area. On this path, you go over numerous areas that echo hollow when walked across. It makes you wonder how much of the area hides an unseen labyrinth just under the surface. Several mounds could easily conceal entrances to tunnels that would rival the ape caves. The only other strange find in this location came while Jacob was pursuing a feeling on one of these side paths. Jacob chose this path because it seemed to have a high proportion of snapped trees, making it hard to proceed down. The group of friends were all pretty tired from the climb through the ape caves, and quickly gave up wanting to climb over the makeshift barricades. They stopped for a quick rest, and Jacob noticed something strange. On the ground was a hand-sized clump of fur. It was only about an inch or two long, but the color was what Jacob found strange. Lots of creatures shed around this time of year, but not many with this unique color of fur. It was a brown and reddish color. He beckoned his friends to come over and take a look, and they immediately thought that they should take a sample to mail off to a lab. Jacob had a laugh at their expense. Lab results could potentially cost hundreds if not thousands of dollars and yield nothing but someone's dog shedding in the early summer. So they talked about what kind of animal had fur in this color and consistency. The best answer that they could come up with was perhaps a fox. Even though this is a well-traveled area, they were still off a rarely used side path. It was hard for any of them to imagine that someone's dog would be walking this far from a parking area and shedding this heavily. They looked around the area for some more, but after not finding any other strange fur, they headed back to the parking area without further incidents to note other than one. There was a strange abundance of mushrooms throughout this whole area. Jacob has heard legends and seen art that depicts Sasquatch or people of the forest heavily relying on mushrooms as a food source. When they reached the truck, they all agreed that there was only one spot left that needed to be investigated. It had to be Ape Canyon, right down the road about 20 miles. This hike was home to the most credible Sasquatch encounters in Washington state history. The friends had no idea how long or how hard this hike was. All they knew was that this provided their next best chance to have an encounter. When they arrived, they read the trail sign. The friends were a little intimidated to read that the hike of Ape Canyon was 5 miles one way and a potential 10 miles round trip. They were already pretty tired. They had already hiked around 4 miles. About a mile and a half of this hiking was hard climbing inside the ape caves. They agreed that they would pack some trail beers in their pockets and hike until they were gone. Once they were gone, they would assess the situation and come up with a plan. They reached the trailhead a little after 3 o'clock. The trail started at a mild incline. The friends are used to hiking in the Olympics, where the trails are much steeper and less maintained. Ape Canyon has a gentle incline for the whole trek. About 2 miles in, Jacob noticed a trail to the right. This was fairly overgrown and had several trees snapped over it that had become a hallmark of the trip. Jacob pointed it out to his friends and had hypothesized that perhaps this was a trail that led to the long-lost miner's cabin that had been attacked decades before. The location of the cabin is supposedly lost to history and has not been found since before Mount St. Helens erupted. The friends all agreed that if they ever came back to this area, they should explore this side path instead of visiting the ape caves. They continued for around another mile before they had their first strange encounter. Around mile 3, as the trees transitioned from new growth to larger old growth trees, they had heard a calling from some distance away. This noise is hard to describe, as many cryptid calls are. It was a woo woo woo, followed by a pause. Then they would hear it again. They noticed it as a very deep bass noise, and even from that distance it sent a resonating shockwave into their chests. This noise was coming from a far off distance, at least a half a mile, and did not seem to be getting any closer. The friends began to get on edge and asked what was making the noise. Jacob told them he thought it was a Sasquatch making a warning noise. He had heard the exact same noise in a different location about a month prior. Jacob told them he identified the noises as a warning call to not get any closer. The friend Jacob was with on that other occasion swore that he had thought it was a bear noise. Jacob has seen and been around bears on multiple occasions and has never heard them make a noise like this. Only one of the friends, named Julius, had a gun on this hike, as it was an impromptu event. He asked what they should do. Jacob told him that they would change the marching order. Jacob would take the lead with his knife, he would follow next with his sidearm, and our completely unarmed friend, Joe, would bring up the rear. They hike past this area without any further incidents, and shortly after this, Joe, the one without a weapon, began complaining and saying that he wanted to turn back. He claimed to be getting worried about getting back in time to set up camp before nightfall. However, he was also not in the best shape to be hiking over 10 miles in a day in rough terrain. Jacob also thought he was feeling uncomfortable about not bringing his gun on the hike and hearing the strange calling noises. Joe began to blame Jacob for the lack of supplies he had brought, and during this time it was about 5:30 p.m. They had not been going very fast because Joe was not in great hiking shape. The group began to get some sporadic cell service at this time. They were getting above the tree line, and somehow cell waves were starting to ping off their phones, so they called the Lone Fir Resort, making reservations. Check-in time went until 9 p.m., and the resort claimed to accommodate late arrivals. They agreed that they would continue to hike until 7 before turning around. The return trip should be quicker, as it was mainly downhill. With this plan in place, they continued up the mountain. As the friends climbed higher and higher, they realized across the valley was the exact spot where they had camped the night before. They realized the blocked-off road they had encountered the day before would have led them down into the valley they were now hiking up. They reached the top of the canyon without further incidents. Mount St. Helens loomed large and magnificent in their view. The sun was shining from behind the mountain, hitting it with golden light beams. The canyon entrance was huge and extended for miles down the valley. During most of the hike, they had been in the forest, so had not seen much of the canyon before this. It was much longer and larger than they had suspected. It was a huge gap several hundred feet deep. They wondered if anything of this prospector's cabin remained hidden in the valley below. The friends reached the top right around 6:45 p.m. They looked around until 7 when they all agreed they would head back down the canyon. The friends began back down at the quickest pace Joe could handle. The goal was to hike about 5 miles back to the truck in an hour and a half so they could save on the fee for late check-in. 5 miles downhill in this time should be doable. They all agreed. 2 miles into the return trip, they heard the noise again. Woo, woo, woo. This was more or less in the exact same spot they had heard the noise on the way up. The trio had talked about how it was so strange that they would hear this noise in literally the same spot well over an hour later. The friends agreed that it was as though something was warning them to stay out of its territory. As they rounded a bend in the path, a second call started up. This one was now directly in front of them, just off the path. The wooing continued, and this call was coming from only about 50 yards ahead. And the call was so loud that it was like a bass drum being struck each time it started. The one in front of them would also sound the woo noise, followed by a further away call behind them. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that there were now at least 2 bears or creatures making these calls, and they appeared to be surrounded. When the call in front of them would sound, it was almost hard not to panic and break into full flight or flight. Nobody was around. They had not seen other hikers this whole time, and they still had 3+ miles back to the parking area. And every time the wooing would sound, the shock waves would hit you in the chest like a deep bass from a drum or very loud speakers, like a subwoofer. Each time the creature in front would make these noise, it would be answered by the one behind them. This one seemed to be getting closer. The one that was in front of them sounded so close, they began to whisper amongst themselves that they didn't understand. With the sound being so close, they should be able to see such a large bear or creature making noise. Jacob also talked to his friends the night before that Sasquatch had a natural camouflage, if not outright cloaking abilities. This seemed to be true, as they could literally not seem to locate a large beast somewhere right in front of them where the loud noises were coming from. Jacob is still on the fence if Sasquatch can completely go invisible or if its fur acts as a natural ghillie suit. One thing is for sure, they should have been able to easily see what was making the noise just off the trail in front of their faces. The friends fought outright terror and in panic huddled up to devise a plan. They had to walk right past the area the sound in front of them was coming from, and each wooing was hitting a resonance that seemed to make them want to panic and take flight after each tone. Jacob told his friends he would lead the way again with his knife out, as if that would really do anything. They would sneak past the beast so they could not give away their position, even though they were already known about and suspected they were being watched. The friends also agreed on the fact they needed to get out of there before the one behind them got any closer. As Jacob crept leading the way down the path, his 3-inch, hopefully enchanted knife seemed like a meager defense against a creature capable of making such an intense noise. Each time they heard the wooing, a sound wave would hit them and they would have to fight off this wave of panic and fear. This carried on for well over 5 minutes as they snuck down the mountain. Joe and the friend that had left his gun in the truck had the foresight to record a video of the sounds. Once they cleared the area by about a quarter mile or so, the calls had suddenly ceased. As quickly as they started, they suddenly ended. The friends continued down the mountain in silence for about another mile before they began to talk about the encounter. Julius, their friend with his sidearm, admitted that it was the scariest experience of his entire life. Joe, the friend that had taken the video, agreed that it was one of the top moments. Jacob had a similar experience just a week before on a solo investigation. For him, experiences like this were just part of the territory. Jacob had even heard that same noise in the past. However, this was the closest he had ever heard them. They listened to Joe's audio recording. Although it was audible, it did not sound very impressive and fear-inducing, as in person. Days later, Joe claimed to be able to isolate the sound better. He claimed to have sent the sound to an animal sound expert on that first impression, said that it sounded like a large primate making the noise. He also asked that Jacob not include the audio in this report. Jacob told him he was not interested in the video and audio and only the story and experience itself. The friends had reached the truck almost exactly at 9 p.m., reaching the hotel at around 9:30. All the lights were off, and they called the number listed on the website for after-hours check-in. No one answered, and they did not leave a message. They assumed that it was too late even for a late check-in, but Jacob suggested that they go down to the local road to a local campground and set up camp. It was very dark, and the other two friends were adamant that they just wanted to drive the close to 4 hours back to their houses. Jacob wanted to camp again, but was outvoted. The others claimed it had nothing to do with the experience, and they just wanted to sleep in a normal bed. Since they had apparently missed the check-in time, the next closest bed was home. Jacob did not agree, but he did not want to be a dissenter. It had been a long, dramatic day. They were all tired from their experiences and the close to 15 miles that they had hiked that day. Now we move into the speculations. Jacob wanted to start the last section out with a few obvious conclusions and then move into more outlandish speculations. The ape caves almost definitely did or do house Sasquatch in some manner, either acting as a way to quickly move about the area or as a possible permanent residence. Who knows? Maybe tunnels really do connect far-off regions all over the country. Any number of rocks could act as doors that quickly roll out of the way when needed. The caves close at dusk, so they could still potentially be used after hours with little fear of being disturbed. But further similar caves are spread throughout the area. Who knows how many equally impressive caves are lurking in the dense underbrush that have yet to be discovered or may never be discovered. The area where the Ape Canyon is located seems to be a hot spot for Sasquatch. When the friends were on the other side exploring rarely used logging roads, any that seemed to lead into the valley were blocked, either by trees that were pushed over or by the mangled gate. There are not many ways into this region other than simply bushwhacking over rough terrain. Either by design or accident, this makes a remote region where Sasquatch can habitat with little disturbances. If interlopers get too close to this area, they will try to scare them off to the best of their ability. Jacob has little doubt that if they had not been frightened off by the noise, they would have soon found themselves being assailed by throwing rocks. This would have been similar to the prospectors driven from the area decades before. Joe, the friend that recorded the sounds, is convinced that he will get validation from an expert that the sounds they heard were from primate vocal cords. Jacob is not convinced they will yield conclusive results. He has heard better evidence submitted to experts that has come back inconclusive. Even with validation, Jacob told Joe that people will still claim that it was an elaborate hoax. Jacob had explained that no amount of evidence is ever enough. Had they taken the cast of the prints, people would still claim they had forged them. Even if they had captured a Sasquatch on video, they would still be told it was someone in a suit. Again, no amount of evidence other than a corpse would satisfy skeptics. Sasquatch is not a stupid creature and will not let humans kill it easily. They know when it is hunting season and the location humans are allowed to hunt. They also are incredibly stealthy and fast. If a human has a gun, they are not going to present themselves to be shot. Further, several people have claimed to have shot one and it yielded little effect. Joe, however, is convinced that he now needs an infrared camera carrying drone for their next outing. He wants to return to the area with better equipment and cast-taking supplies. Jacob will of course join him, but only for the story experience and not the hard evidence. Now, Jacob will get into some further speculation. He was explaining to his neighbor that there is a preponderance of evidence that the National Park System acts as a reservation for cryptids. As long as people stay in our human areas, we are pretty safe. When we get off trail or into rarely used trails, that is when we run a risk of encountering various unknown creatures. Jacob told him that this was some deal that the government may have worked out. Many presidents were and are known members of various occult secret societies. These societies claim to have sacred knowledge about how to communicate with different beings and supernatural entities. Maybe this is how they reach these agreements. Another speculation that Jacob has about this area is that there are either private or government facilities in this area using a portion of these cave systems. The Swift Reservoir and hydroelectric plant all show the hallmarks of a secret government base, or at least a private base of that. The surrounding area has the same topography as the Ape Caves area. He would hypothesize that caves run throughout these structures and connect them underground in some capacity. The hydro dam can supply convenient power for whatever purposes they need. Who knows how many contacts the workers have had with Sasquatch? Jacob even thinks that all the locals that just moved to the area may be some kind of undercover employees. Maybe they have a deployment rotation to the area and act as actors to throw people off the trail. His wife points out that he had a small sample size, but of the 4 locals, Jacob had direct contact with 3 of them, claiming to have just moved to the area. Maybe that is a scripted response that these people are told to say. Maybe most visitors do not talk to multiple residents to become suspicious of this standard response. Maybe, after a year or 2, they are moved on to the next location and the next group moves in. Jacob thinks these government or possible private compounds may also have to do with the large off-grid communities he saw being built. Maybe tunnels connect these large, expensive compounds to these houses. Who knows how many personnel are housed in this area? A private army could be lurking, waiting for a worst-case scenario when society crumbles. The rich super elite will flee to this area with a small army of guards and resources to rebuild what is left. If this sounds like conspiratorial talk, it is truer than most people believe without internet sleuthing. Billionaires have been buying up large tracts of land all over the country for decades. Then, they quietly develop them with bunkers and supplies. Maybe they even have to contact or work with Sasquatches or potentially other creatures. One thing is for sure, the area around Mount St. Helens is filled with mysteries. Jacob could do an investigation each day for years and never have enough satisfying answers. Each trip just opens up new mysteries. They never end. There is no conclusion. Oftentimes, an ending has to be made up to provide any closure. If you want to support Jacob's writing, make sure you go ahead and pick up a copy of his book, Northwest Mythology. A link will be in the description below. If you have an area around Washington State that you think I should send Jacob off to investigate, leave a comment explaining here and why. What do you guys think is going on in the area? Have you visited the Ape Caves, or would you like to? Did you like this 2-part format? Should I enlist Jacob to explore more regions here in Washington State? Do you think you would have been braver in the same situations? I would love to know what you think. And as Jacob had said, there is no amount of evidence that will ever be enough for skeptics short of a corpse. Even then, some might call it fake. If you are a believer, then you believe even with a lack of hard evidence. It is almost like believing in a higher power, for those that believe the evidence is everywhere, in the form of a perfect sunset or a miracle of a child being born. For non-believers, these are just mundane things created by circumstance and science. For those believers with their eyes open, the amount of evidence paints a clear picture that there are things that cannot be explained lurking just beneath, what we all think and know. Unless, of course, you end up with a video like this one in which a person actually happened to snap a Polaroid of their encounter.